back in the studio, and there's a few things I've been thinking about. And one of those is how AI, image generation, and AI generated art is doing so much more for artists than museums and journalists are actually doing for artists. And I'll explain what that means. I was thinking, okay, I think the hyper-capitalization and commercialization of art obviously does not incentivize innovation, because if you want money, which everyone does, you are going to bend to the wills and wants of your customer base. And those are not the people that are responsible for proposing and propagating interesting ideas. So, okay, I feel like you're in a capitalist situation. What do? You have to rely on it, or you have to hopefully rely on the government or grants or private institutional funding, and just hope that they don't have some sort of commercial interest, which they usually do, because even institutions, they have boards of directors, they have people that sit on have a chair as the board of advisee, and those are usually very expensive. Those are wealthy donors, collectors usually, and they have a pretty commercial interest in their involvement with institutions. So then what would a communist, I guess, environment in art look like? How could artists, could art thrive in communism? And I guess the answer is you would have these state-funded institutions that are, I guess, let's say you have these state-funded curators for museums, state-funded museums, and you have these curators on that team, and they have zero commercial interest. There are no board of advisees that care about what work is added to the permanent collection. You just have curators and museum directors that just studied art. So, who would they choose? What kind of artists would they choose? Probably be very different from the kind of artists that are being picked for museums right now, without the kind of puppet strings of other secret commercial powers within the institutions. I don't know what that would look like, but it would definitely be different. So let's say you have these state-funded institutions, and these curators have no commercial influence to whatever extent you can trust a human. If you have a set salary, there's always going to be corruption, but if you have a set salary and you're a curator and you love art, then and there's hopefully anti-corruption policies set in place, then you'll pick something from what you actually like. You like artists and art you actually think are interesting. So let's say you have that situation, and what that is going to do is change the zeitgeist of what artists are making. Let's say artists that get picked by certain state-funded institutions. You can increase your salary, the government provides a universal basic income for artists, but it's it's just enough to live, just enough to have a small apartment, pay medical expenses, everything that universal basic income can help the general population, the working class. But like if you want more money, let's say you want more luxuries in life, how would you achieve that in this kind of like, I guess, this quote unquote like state funded art industry? And the way that you could potentially do that is, for your art to be accepted into these state-funded institutions with state-funded curators. Like if you're selected for if your work is selected to be put in the permanent collection of one of the big ones, or you have a show with one of these big institutions, then you can be granted like a higher income, I guess, provided by the state. So you have to fight for it. You have to obviously work for it. It's not something that's given to you as a human right or just as any working artist. So you'll probably kind of have to think like, oh, what do these institutions want? I should make art that the curators that work there, I guess it kind of bends to the wills of what they want. But what I'm getting at is it'll be more interesting, I think, what curators find interesting in art if they're not secretly influenced by commercial interest. And I think there's a lot of curators currently and museum directors that are in it purely for the name of the game, but I think it's hard to argue that those that hold the money in art have the power, and I can confidently say that curators and museum directors are not the ultra wealthy pulling the strings. And I'm pretty sure people that have art history degrees are not the top 1% controlling the culture industry. So I'm not saying that this system isn't already happening in museums and whatnot. I'm just saying when you kind of like look at how the general zeitgeist of trends in the fine art world develop, I think they're heavily, and even in the institutional space, I think they're very heavily influenced by the free market of the commercial contemporary art world. Just because the players in the game, whether or not it's institutions or collectors and just purely the commercial sector, they have so much influence because they have so much money, so they control so much of what's going on for whatever personal reason, mostly tax reasons and profit reasons. So what do I mean when I say that AI is doing more than what the well, let me go back to actually what I was kind of talking about. Like, okay, so let's say you're an artist and you're in this fantasy situation where you have a universal basic income, but you want more money, so you want to get accepted into these institutions. And so you have to kind of bend to the wills of the curator and the museum directors and the vetting committee and whatnot. Yeah, you're obviously still being influenced, but what's more interesting, I think, is that on the flip side, if you are a curator and you are hired in a powerful position at one of these state-funded big museums and institutions, and if you have absolute zero commercial incentive, but you have a lot of power and you don't have to answer for, and it's state-funded, so you don't have to worry about ticket ticket sales and all of that, income from book the gift shops and whatnot. I mean, oftentimes like museums have no money, and a lot of their money just comes from, or a lot of their profit comes from donations, and like gift shop and ticket sales. It's very tough. It's very tough for museums to really nowadays currently find any funding or money for anything, because they are really trying to act as a public good, like a public service essentially, but they're private, so like they want to be pure, they want to include good art, but they're always out of funding. They're always struggling to figure out funding, and guess what? You know, when you're desperate for money, you're going to turn to pretty bland and basic commercial ploys, and I guess a good example of that is Team Labs and interactive museums. You know, why are all museums now suddenly doing these immersive experience where there's projection mapping and they're very TikTokable? It's just because it gets people in the door, and these museums can now get more money from ticket sales, and everyone will be happy. The staff will be happy. The owners of the museum will be happy. Executive, everyone will be happy. There's just more money. But the quality of the art suffers because it has to bend to the wants and desires of the general public. And that's great. I think you can give people experiences they enjoy. I think that is a great deed that art can do. But again, it's not a system that inspires and encourages innovation, because innovation is inherently uncomfortable, but it is necessary to push culture forward. You need, I mean, not just culture, but any industry, you need innovators. So you obviously need a system that encourages innovation. And in this hyper-capitalist art market, how could you possibly encourage risk and innovation in this current system? The quick and easy answer is you really can't. And artists that have a lot of cultural legacy or they're going to be a unicorn. It's going to be very rare. And that's so sad, because like, you know, like you want obviously more really radical artists and innovative artists to leave their mark in the world. Like, you know, if you saw a good film and you love the director, like, and you want more films from that director, you're like, oh my God, like, I love this director. This movie was so good. This film was so good. I wish it would make like one of these a month, but they're one person and they can't. So what is the answer? Like, oh, I mean, I wish there was another director that was just as good that could, and you know, and if you like music and you're like, oh, I love this artist, I love this genre, it's so fresh and new. Man, they haven't released an album in such a long time. I wish it would release like a couple albums a month. Like, unrealistic. The only realistic way to fulfill that kind of demand is just have more innovative artists. And so you need a structure to fulfill that demand. You know, you obviously don't want to just have this commercial system, hyper-capitalist system, in which most artists are boring, but they're serving the very basic, generic needs of the people, and they're making a lot of money doing that. Because they're making a lot of money doing that, they're not incentivized to innovate, so their work is just bland and whatever. And that's kind of actually most commercially successful artists, you know, whether they like to admit it or not, because innovation at the end of the day is scary, and it risks a lot of stability. And we're human. We have mouths to feed. We have ourselves to think about. We have bills to pay. We have employees to pay. And we really want to live a happy life. So obviously, on the artist end of a commercially successful artist, why would you want to destabilize that? The answer is you wouldn't. There's no incentive to. And, live your best life. But I'm purely talking in like this fantasy situation where, like, if all artists just didn't have to worry about necessarily selling out a show, if because they at the end of the day they knew, like, oh, I'm gonna get a universal basic income, like, let's say I get 2K at the end of the month, so long as I budget my food, I can pay for my housing, I can pay for all the basic necessities of life, then I would say most artists would really be happy just making art. And let's say they do show at a commercial gallery, and or just a gallery. A gallery doesn't have to be commercially oriented. It could just be a, let's say, state-funded gallery, essentially a small institution. And maybe things are for sale, because I'm not talking about pure communism. There's still a free market in this scenario, but there are like are socialist like kind of barriers, I guess, to prevent like the working class from getting fucked. And I guess, like, in this scenario, my go-to example is universal basic income. So let's say an artist is showing in this state-funded gallery and nothing sells, but they know that they can still pay their bills. People really like the work. Or, I guess maybe a select amount of people really like the work, like, not necessarily commercially successful, but niche crowds and bohemian types, other creatives like the work. You'll feel fulfilled. You made art, you get to pay your bills, you get to live comfortably, and you can continue making art. That's a great scenario. And let's say you keep doing those shows. You're going to be quite bored with what you made. So you really have all the incentives in the world in this situation to innovate. Because, again, your basic needs are met with this universal basic income. Doesn't matter. So why would you make formulaic work for the sake of what? For the sake of nothing, right? Obviously, if you're purely money driven, you're just naturally going to fold to the demands of the public and the market. And sure, like that there's people that are totally fine with that. There are people that enter the arts because they had a skill or talent maybe early on, but they didn't necessarily have a burning passion for the arts per se. It was something they enjoyed. It was maybe a hobby in school, and maybe they weren't very good at math or science or tech or reading or anything, and they just had a very natural talent for art. So that would create a lot of reason to become an artist. But it wasn't, at the end of the day, this deep desire for contributing something on a mass cultural level. And that's going to be most people. But I went to art school, so there, you see other types. You meet a lot of other students that actually do care so much about art history and critical theory, and they probably come from privileged families, so they're not really thinking about money, which is that's a privilege, but they're not really thinking about money. They're just in art school because it's like they love art and they want to be a part of it, and they're not worried after school, like their parents. So this is kind of like, I guess, privatized universal basic income, rich parents. And that's what you see in a lot of these art schools, right? Like these students that are funded by their parents. And it's kind of great because then you get, I guess, a little incubator situation of what I'm talking about in this tangent. So you have these rich rich kids that go to art school and they have no worries about what they're going to do after graduation. So you talk to them and they just are nerds for critical theory and art history and contemporary art. And they have a burning passion for it. And sometimes, and maybe oftentimes, with good guidance and good professors, those artists are the ones that make really interesting shit. Or like, not necessarily interesting, sometimes it's terrible, but it's like radical. And it's like hit or miss. So sometimes something radical and it's pure shock, and you're like, oh, wow, that's wild. Okay, that's not hitting. But then after a while, like some of these art kids make something amazing. And you would never really be able to enable that opportunity if they were these kind of rich, privileged art kids were under the constant threat of being broke. So that's a good example. A real world example of how this kind of like theory of mine has had real world applications. It just happens on a private level, not like a nationwide state level. But let's say all artists that graduated art school, the financial support of rich parents would come at a federal level. Then I think you would have much higher frequency of like interesting radical shit coming out of their studios. And on the flip side, curators with very little, puppeteering from museum directors or board of advisees or donors of the museum, powerful donors, probably those curators it would be the same. They studied art history, so their ideas, their perceptions of what innovation looks like is going to be quite radical, and it's going to happen at a higher frequency because, again, this idea of universal basic income would also support curators and people that work in the museum, so they can leave art school or have an art history degree and not worry about employment or getting a livable salary. Let's say like their living standards are already financially met. You're going to have a much more radical idea of what art is. Okay, so now that this like kind of system of this fantasy system of my thinking, I've kind of communicated. Let me get to the title of this video, which is probably going to be something along the lines of AI art is doing a lot more for artists in our community than museums are. So what does that mean? People think like AI is not creative, it's not inventive, it trains off of data, right? And let's say you're creating art with AI and it kind of like looks like stuff you've seen before because it's training off of what is proliferated online, and AI has a very strong understanding or it trains off of what's popular. Like it understands Ghibli and popular anime, those styles of illustration, because those are really popular, and so there's a lot of data to train off of. Obviously, popular styles and popular ways of making are going to gain so much more momentum, and inevitably AI will train off of it. So you have all this nice looking but uninventive like AI generated art that's not additive, and technically people should be liking it on an aesthetic level because it's trained off of everything that the average person likes. I'm not talking about I'm not talking about someone who studied like conceptual performance art from 1970s and 60s at UCLA. Like I'm talking about just like the average person, average Instagram user. Like if if they're all training off of what it sees people like, then it's going to reflect and create AI generated art that people like. But still, people are like, oh, this is all slop. And it's interesting that they're coming to this realization it's all slop. Because there's no external force. There was no institution telling them like what good art is, what bad art is, what a basic taste in art looks like. People are starting to just come to this conclusion naturally. And museums currently exist to protect, I guess, the integrity of the innovations of art. So when you go to a museum, a contemporary art museum, and you see shit that makes no sense, you're like, this is bullshit, what is this? It's weird, it's gross, it doesn't make any sense. Museums are there to protect the integrity, and they are doing their best, I think, for the most part, without the puppeteering in the background. There's obviously a authentic effort to protect that integrity. But it's tough because most people don't care. The average person doesn't care, so why would they pay 10, 20, 30 bucks to enter this museum to see weird radical art they don't understand or like? Which is why museums are transitioning to this TeamLab immersive art model. It's kind of abandoning that integrity, but it is protecting the survival of those institutions. So, you win some, you lose some. But AI is doing that naturally, because a lot of these services are free, and even just seeing AI art is free. It's like cluttering our For You pages and Explore pages. So we don't have to pay some sort of museum fee to look at art that we now deem as slop. It just pops up on our feed, and now we're like, oh, this is kind of cool. You look in the comments, oh, this is AI generated. And then instantly you're like, well, now I don't like it because it's fucking slop. Kind of an amazing conclusion to make, naturally, as just some TikTok or Instagram user. You've come to this conclusion that this is something maybe you kind of are interested in on a visual level. Then you find out it's AI. You realize you've been tricked. It has no humanity in it. Now you don't like it. And I genuinely think people that have that kind of interaction and visual digestion of AI art, I genuinely think that they don't like the slop once they find out it's AI generated. And so there's not really a solution. All you can really do is maybe do your best to avoid liking and sharing AI stuff so algorithms don't push it to you. But there is no supplement. I mean, there technically is, like, you could actually seek out in-person live art events that are 100% human-made and these analog experiences that cannot be replicated by AI currently. You could do that, but most people don't because they don't care that much yet. So I guess the average experience is, I see AI slop on my For You page. I don't like it. I want to avoid it. Great. Unfortunately, I think the world is going to be filled with a lot of AI-generated music, art, and anything cultural. And it's going to be impossible to avoid. So it sounds like I'm countering my argument by proving that AI is horrible for our community. But going back to that very individualistically driven guttural reaction of, oh, it's AI slop because there's no humanity. That is what art has been trying to push, that discourse of what defines art. Artists have been trying to radically push to the public for a long time, and it organically does become quotidian I mean, you can see how, for example, like architecture, what people like has changed. Like we used to like Victorian. I mean, I guess like the wealthy used to deem like Victorian maximalism as aesthetic, and then maybe kind of Art Deco in the early, like the 20s or 30s, and then now there's a lot of people that are into brutalism, and who'd have thought, going from Victorian maximalism to eco-brutalism, there had to be some sort of organic cultural progression at some point. And I won't get into the art history of it all, but everyone can agree that culture organically develops in the background. And most people don't understand how that system works unless you study arts and culture. But most people just are at the whim of cultural development, right? So going back to what museums have been trying to do, if museums didn't give a fuck about closing down and they refused to do this Team Labs type monetization to incentivize ticket sales, they and let's say they had total control of how people experience the museum. If you took a curator that had some sort of psychic power that they could control the reaction of every museum goer, they would obviously, the show that this curator curated, they would obviously want everyone to have an enjoyable, interesting, or at least transformative reaction. And the unfortunate case is the average museum goer doesn't from radical contemporary art. Even though the curator did their best to bring something new that they thought was interesting and important to show. But I know if you give that superpower to a curator, they would make sure everyone extracts something educational and transformative. But you can't, because that power doesn't exist. But AI has that power. That whole instinctual reaction or that turns people off of AI is purely one's own choice to choose to believe they don't like AI because it lacks humanity. Museums can't do that. Curators can't force other people to feel that. But AI image generation models are doing that. Totally art uneducated people are looking at AI art and just thinking it's terrible or ugly or slop. Kind of amazing. They're coming to that conclusion organically, going back to that idea that culture develops organically. But unfortunately, in the next maybe 5 to 10 years, a majority of what you see online is going to be AI generated, and maybe in a dystopian reality, people are going to give up on criticizing very generic AI, and they're just going to give into it, and it's going to have this weird cultural feedback loop where visual aesthetics and visual trends are cannibalizing itself, and I don't know what that would look like. That would be dystopian. I really hope the pushback for AI generated art propels human artists into a new direction, and the people want it. If you are someone that has seen just a shitty, ugly image that you knew wasn't human made, you already probably in the back of your mind have the demand for something that's human made. I think you would have rather stumbled upon an artwork that was human made. But you don't know where to find it because you're just scrolling. You're just doom scrolling. You know what you don't like, but you don't necessarily know what you like. So it is the responsibility of the artist to provide something that the new people of this post-AI world want, but they don't know that they want. Or maybe a type of art in the post AI art generation, the post AI art world, what is art going to look like that people don't know they want, but they deserve or they need? And that's what interests me. Because artists, human artists, in order to avoid this weird derivative feedback loop of AI models training off of AI art, and it's become something strange and making art of styles that were originally like had AI sensibility, but maybe were trained off of a human, like that of however many generations ago. In the dystopian future, human artists are going to have to do their best to be like, okay, what the fuck is like anti-AI? What is something that cannot be replicated or so weird and wild and only humans would be able to think about, that image generation models can't, or not can't, but won't replicate, I guess as an artist, you have to think, what is in the data set that doesn't exist yet? Because these models are training off of what they see online. So as an artist, you kind of have to look, okay, you obviously, you have to know what is popular, and I guess like understanding art history. The history is written by the winners, so the artists written in art history are the winners, and those are who people know: Picasso, Van Gogh, Basquiat, Andy Warhol. They're the winners. They're not the best artists of their time. They were the winners of art history, and they got the most coverage. That's why people know them, and that's why AI models probably can generate some Andy Warhol looking art easy. Humans, Adobe Illustrator can generate that style easy. It's just pre-AI. So as an artist, first you have to study art history, or you have to at least know it. You have to see who the winners are, because those are the people and the artists and the artworks that these AI models are training off of. So you can break that mold. So instead of thinking what is radical and undone, maybe it's more important to think what is just not in the data set yet. Because eventually, if you do become an influential human artist, you will become a part of the data set. But then, the new meta will be discovered by the younger generations, and so on and so on. That's how culture progresses. It's inevitable, and that's a good thing. But currently, how should human artists react? I guess it just comes down to that. Like, what is something that just isn't popular, isn't being digested and studied by these AI models? So maybe at one point you were a Basquiat TikTok artist, and then before ChatGPT and DALL-E, and then now you kind of realize, oh man, every dude is doing Basquiat looking paintings, and I was even playing with AI generated image models, and I could easily create Basquiat looking paintings, and that's boring to me now. Maybe someone like that, it would just naturally outgrow these like quotidian styles, and then they're kind of left thinking, what can I do? What can I do that I won't be exhausted by, that can't easily be replicated? It's going to naturally, the conclusion is going to be some sort of style or artwork that is just totally outside of the norm. And I don't know what that is yet. I think it's interesting to think about, and I think the responsibility of artists is to think about that and to think about how to manifest that into the world. And so I'm hoping a new generation of artists will be encouraged to do so, because they're just so exhausted by AI slop. And just purely from that dissatisfaction with how art is, what type of art is proliferated online, whether it's through Instagram or Spotify, is going to be artists that, like, unfathomable amount of artists in the next generation, the post-AI generation, that are just going to make some of those groundbreaking shit of the past century. So what is the conclusion? It's ultimately, museums, curators, people that study art can't force the general public to think or feel any way. But AI art is quickly making people realize generic, humanless art is uninteresting. And that's a great thing. And I think the more AI slop is out there, the quicker the public will realize, oh man, I was like secretly basic and my taste was basic, and now I'm changing and I'm open to something new because I'm so sick and exhausted of the generic, the basic. And there's going to be demand for the human. So I guess what I'm saying is that new demand can finally exceed the supply. I think the reason why artists that go to art school to learn painting or ceramics or sculpture or performance were always kind of memed on as being poor, and having no job, and an art degree is useless, is because there was no demand. There wasn't enough demand for the amount of artists that graduated from art school. So I have a kind of hope for the future that the demand will actually exceed the supply. Humanity is going to be so exhausted from AI-generated art that it's going to forcefully create such an incredible demand for anything human, any human-generated culture, that the supply will finally meet the demand. And hopefully at one point encourage an even greater supply. More people encouraged to go to art school. More people don't have to worry about, like, art school is so dead end, and studying music and food is such a dead end industry, such a waste of a degree. Like, hopefully there will be a future where high schoolers and middle schoolers don't have to worry about that. And so I hope this all makes sense.